believe, on the future of the transatlantic alliance. Absolutely.
It's a great honor to be here today at Trinity College to be made Honorary Patron of the Philosophical Society. I'm deeply impressed by the fact that it's the world's oldest debating society, more than 325 years old. It's also humbling to be joining the ranks of a long list of distinguished individuals who have spoken before this august body in the past. Although I have a German last name and obviously have distant relatives who came from Germany to the United States, I'm also part Irish, as I have distant relatives who left Ireland in the middle of the 19th century to come to America. Indeed, my father, whose name was Thomas Mearsheimer, was actually 3/4 Irish. I remember well, when I was young, hearing my father say that Irish girls are the most beautiful girls in the world. He said that often. However, that did not stop him from marrying my mother, Ruth Bauman, who was of German descent all the way down. Such is life in that great melting pot called the United States of America. All of this is to say that I take special pleasure as someone who can trace his roots back to Ireland in receiving an honorary patronage in the Philosophical Society here at Trinity College in Dublin. Thank you very much. I'd like to speak today in my more formal remarks about the future of transatlantic relations, basically the future of the United States' relationship with Europe. And I'm not going to speak about future economic relations because I think little is likely to change on that front. What I want to speak about is the future of the security relationship between the United States and Europe. And of course, when you're talking about the future of the security relationship, what you're really talking about is the future of NATO, and to be even more specific, the future of the American military commitment to Europe. And to get at this issue, what you have to think about is what we call in the United States American grand strategy. The American grand strategy is all about the question of what areas of the world are worth fighting and dying for. Where are we willing to spill American blood? Now, there's no question that the area of the world that matters the most to the United States is the Western Hemisphere. Just like the area of the world that matters the most for anyone who is Irish is Europe, because it's your neighborhood, it's your backyard, it's where you're located. So above all else, the United States cares about the Western Hemisphere. But the $64,000 question that we have historically faced as a country is, how do you think about other areas of the world? And again, to get back to the point that I made a few minutes ago, the $64,000 question is, which areas of the world matter so much that you're willing to expend blood and iron in those areas? And there have historically been three areas that mattered to us: Europe, Northeast Asia, and the Persian Gulf. Now, the reason that Europe and Northeast Asia matter so much to the United States is because that's where the other great powers are located. Germany, Napoleonic France, Soviet Union, these were all great powers that were physically located in Europe and that we cared a lot about. And of course, if you go to Asia, Japan, and actually Russia are great powers physically located in that location. And then, of course, the reason we care about the Persian Gulf is not because there are any great powers there, but because that's where oil is located. If you look at American history over time, basically what you see is that the United States spent the 19th century consolidating its position in the Western Hemisphere and not worrying very much at all about other areas of the world. As you know, the United States started out in the late 18th century as a handful of colonies strung out along the eastern seaboard of the United States. And over the course of the first half of the 19th century, this is the 1800s, the United States marched across North America to the Pacific Ocean and carved out what is today continental United States. Most of you probably don't know this, but 200 years ago in 1812, the United States invaded Canada. Why? Because we wanted Canada as part of the United States. The reason that Toronto is not the capital of Canada and Ottawa is the capital of Canada is that the Canadians expected us to pay a return visit, all for the purposes of incorporating Canada into the United States. Countries like Cuba, Jamaica, and Haiti and the Caribbean would all be part of the United States today were it not for the slavery issue. We had a voracious appetite for territory. We wanted to go further south, conquer territory, and incorporate it into the United States. But the northern states would not allow that to happen, in large part because they were afraid that more slaveholding states would come into the Union, because the sugar industry was so dominant in the Caribbean, and the sugar industry is labor intensive, which meant there were lots of slaves in the Caribbean. So the only thing that kept us from going south and making the United States an even bigger country than it is today is the slavery issue. And as I said, we wanted to go north as well, because we really wanted to make Canada part of the United States. By 1853, with the Gadsden Purchase, we had all of what is today the continental United States. And then we spent the rest of the century filling up the country with people. That's why so many Irish and so many Germans and later Poles, Italians, and Jews left Europe and were welcome in the United States. Because we had all this territory, we didn't have hardly any people to fill it up. So we brought huge numbers of immigrants from countries like Ireland to fill the United States up with people. And then, of course, we fought a civil war between 1861 and 1865, and that was all for the purposes of settling the slavery issue. But by 1900, the United States had established itself as by far the most powerful country in the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere was basically taken care of by that point. And then what happened in the 20th century is we began to look abroad. We began to think about intervening in the politics of countries in places like Europe and Asia. Now, very important to understand that throughout our history, Europe has been by far the most important area to us outside of the Western Hemisphere. First time we fought a major war outside of the Western Hemisphere was in World War I. And we intervened in World War I in large part to help finish off Imperial Germany, which looked like it was going to end up dominating all of Europe. Then, of course, in World War II, we fought against Nazi Germany. And during the Cold War, we remained here in Europe for the purposes of containing the Soviet Union. To just show you how important Europe is to the United States, you want to remember that we did not enter World War II until December 7th, 1941. And we entered World War II on December 7th, 1941, because the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor. Hitler did us an enormous favor. He declared war on us 4 days later. Hitler declared war on the United States on December 11th, 1941. But it was the Japanese who attacked us at Pearl Harbor. Nevertheless, before Pearl Harbor and after Pearl Harbor, the United States had what was called a Europe First strategy. Our primary concern was dealing with Nazi Germany, not dealing with Imperial Japan. because Europe was of much greater strategic importance than East Asia was to the United States, and Germany was considered to be a much greater threat to American security interest than Imperial Japan. So we had a Europe-first strategy. During the Cold War, we had to contain the Soviet Union. As you all know as good students of geography, the Soviet Union, Russia before that and Russia after that, is physically located in both Europe and in Asia. So American containment policy during the Cold War was focused on Europe as well as Asia. But our main concern was Europe, because the Soviet Union, although it was an Asian power, was mainly a European power. And when we used to run war games during the Cold War, what we would invariably end up doing in those war games is implementing what we called the swing strategy. And the swing strategy was where we swung most of our forces out of Asia and brought them to Europe. Why to Europe? Because the Central Front in Europe, the inter-German border, was the central focus of the U.S., Soviet, or NATO Warsaw Pact competition. Europe was of seminal importance for purposes of containing the Soviet Union. Japanese and our other Asian allies used to scream that the reason that we had a swing strategy and we moved forces to Asia was because America was run by white people who were descendants of Europeans, and we preferred to privilege Europeans over Asians. That was simply not true. We had a swing strategy because the Soviet threat was mainly in Europe, not in Asia. Just as before that, the big threats we worried about were countries like Imperial Germany, Nazi Germany, and well before that, Napoleonic France. Europe was the #1 American strategic priority. That is changing. We are about to undergo a revolution. Asia is going to be the #1 strategic priority for the United States. Middle East, or the Persian Gulf, is going to be the #2 strategic priority for the United States. And Europe is going to be a distant third. You are not going to matter that much for us anymore. The main reason for this is the rise of China. The United States cares greatly about powerful states in the international system. The United States does not like what the Pentagon refers to as peer competitors. We like the idea that we are by far the most powerful state on the planet, and we have every intention of remaining the most powerful state on the planet. Despite all the liberal rhetoric that you hear coming out of the United States, you always want to remember that the United States is one of the most ruthless great powers that has ever walked the face of the earth. And the United States worked very hard, pursues all sorts of ruthless and brutal policies to establish itself as the most powerful state on the planet, and it will go to enormous lengths to make sure it remains that way. And as you look out on the horizon, there is only one country that can give us a run for our money, and that is China. The United States had 3 principal competitors in the 20th century. They were Germany, Japan, and Russia. The power gap between the United States and all 3 of those countries is going to increase greatly in our favor over the course of the 20th century. And that's in large part due to demographics. Europeans do not make babies in large numbers, and Germany and Russia are both depopulating, and indeed Japan is the most rapidly aging population in the world. The United States, because of immigration, is in excellent shape demographically, and therefore the United States is going to become more and more powerful relative to those 3 countries over time. Again, there's one country out there that makes us very nervous because it has many more people than us, and it's becoming incredibly wealthy, and that country is China. So what did Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama say that the United States was going to do last year? They said that we were going to pivot to Asia. Think about those words. Pivot to Asia. Well, if the United States is going to pivot to somewhere, that means it's pivoting away from somewhere. Where are we going to pivot away from? We're going to pivot away from Europe, in my humble opinion. Now, You might say what we're going to do is we're going to pivot away from the Persian Gulf as well. Remember, I said that the United States has historically had three areas of the world that it cared greatly about: Europe, Asia, and the Gulf. But the reason that we're not going to pivot away from the Gulf is because the Gulf is inextricably bound up with Asia, because China and India are so heavily dependent on oil and gas that comes out of the Persian Gulf. And if anything, the dependence that those two countries, India and China, have on oil and gas that comes out of the Gulf is going to increase with time. So they are going to be deeply interested, those two countries, in what happens in the Persian Gulf. And when people talk about the Chinese building a blue water navy, they're talking about building a blue water navy that can go into the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea and get to the Persian Gulf. So the United States is going to remain deeply interested in the Persian Gulf, and it's going to remain deeply interested in Northeast Asia. It's going to be more interested than ever. That's my basic argument with Northeast Asia. Because again, that's where China is. And China is the only country that can give the United States a run for its money. By the way, if the Chinese economy flatlines, or there's significant domestic political problems inside China, and China is weakened over time and doesn't rise, the United States will be more powerful relative to the rest of the world in 2050 than it is now. Now, if that doesn't prove to be the case, and instead China continues its impressive rise, it might become so powerful that the United States really has no choice but to pull all of its forces out of Europe. A lot depends, that's what I'm saying, a lot depends on just how powerful China gets. But if China gets really powerful, this is a country, remember, that has 4 times the population of the United States. 4 times the population of the United States. If it has a per capita GNP that looks like Taiwan or South Korea or Japan, it'll have a GNP that's, a good 2 or 3 or 4 times as big as the United States. The Soviet Union, at the height of its power in the Cold War, had, I would guess, 1/3 the gross national product of the United States. Think about that. When the United States was up against the Soviet Union had about 1/3 the gross national product of the United States. We're talking about a country that has 3 or 4 times the gross national product of the United States, has 4 times as many people. With all that wealth and all those people, you can build lots of armored division equivalents, you can build lots of ballistic missiles, lots of attack submarines. Right? And plus, we're going to be playing the game in their backyard. Many thousands of miles from the United States. We have to project power over the Pacific Ocean, which is much larger than the Atlantic Ocean. It's going to be very, very tough for us. And if it gets really tough out there, and we're caught up in the Persian Gulf as well, Europe is not going to matter very much. Now, one might say that there is a solution to this problem, and the solution to this problem is that the Europeans will help us. Right? You will help us deal with China. So we will remain joined at the hip because you're going to help us. This is not going to happen. It's not going to happen for a couple of reasons. First of all, your economies here in Europe are in terrible shape. And the idea that you're going to spend a lot of money on defense to project power out into the Pacific Ocean, not going to happen. We're talking about huge distances here. I mean, you may be able to help us on the margins in places like Afghanistan, but if we're talking about containing a mighty China in the Pacific Ocean, you're not going to build the defenses to go out there with us. Right? And furthermore, and this is the key point, you'd be crazy to do so. You want the United States to do the heavy lifting. This is what buck passing is all about in international politics. It's getting the other sucker to do the dirty work. You don't want to have to go out to Asia and do the balancing against China. You want the United States to do that. And if anything, I would argue, for people who are looking for a good topic to write a thesis on, this is a really very interesting question. Whether or not you, Europeans, will actually trade with China and try to benefit from the fact that the United States and China are antagonists and grow your economies by trading with China. I think that is likely to happen. I'm not saying it will axiomatically happen, but I think it's likely to happen. So my point is, I don't think that Europe is going to be saved in the story I'm telling by helping the United States contain China. Indeed, I think if anything, the opposite will be the case. Now we come to an issue of great importance. Why should you care? There are many countries around the world that should be happy if the United States is not active in their region. Because as you know, when the United States is in your region of the world, in some cases, it's like sleeping with an elephant. There's always the danger the elephant will roll over and crush you. It's a good thing to always have the United States in your backyard. But that's not true in the case of Europe. When the Cold War ended, there were a number of people who thought that the Americans would leave Europe and come home. But we did not. We have stayed in Europe. And as I'm sure many of you have noticed, no European leader has asked the Americans to go home. Not a single case of a European leader asking the Americans to go home. And in fact, the Europeans are happy with the fact that the United States is in Europe, the United States military. Why is that the case? It's very simple. Because the United States acts as a pacifier. You know what happened yesterday in Stockholm? The EU was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for facilitating or keeping the peace in Europe. This was a giant mistake. That award should not have been given to the EU. That award should have been given to NATO. The reason that you have peace in Europe is because the American military is physically located in Europe, and we maintain the peace. That's why we stayed here after the Cold War, and that's why nobody's asking us to leave. It's not the European Union. We'd go home if it was the European Union. Why would we spend all this money defending Europe if war had been burned out of Europe? It makes absolutely no sense. We're here for one very good reason. We are the pacifier. And the heart and soul of the problem is Germany. You understand, if we go, the Germans have to provide for their own security. The Germans have no nuclear weapons. They're physically located in the center of Europe. They would become a normal state. Nobody wants Germany to become a normal state. They want the United States of America to put its security umbrella, more specifically, its nuclear umbrella, over Germany. The whole purpose of expanding NATO eastward was to create a giant zone of peace in Europe. That's why the Americans want to incorporate countries like Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. They want to make it impossible for the Russians to cause any trouble anywhere. It's the American pacifier. Well, the question you want to ask yourself is, what happens if the American pacifier disappears? What happens if the Americans leave because they have to go to Asia to deal with this growing Chinese threat? Then Germany will have to provide for its own security. And the EU, if you believe the EU has been one of the principal causes of peace, things are not looking too good on that front, by the way. The EU appears to be in quite bad shape to me. And if anything, its problems are stoking nationalism in Europe, not promoting internationalism. So at a time when the EU is in trouble, and NATO may be in trouble, given the analysis I'm presenting here, it's not good for Europe. So what does this all mean for how Europeans think about international politics? I think it has three broad implications. First of all, you should hope that China does not continue to rise economically and therefore militarily. You should hope that China's rise stops, that the Chinese economy either flatlines or grows very slowly in the future. and that the China threat never materializes. Second, you should hope that America maintains its imperial impulse. This deep-seated belief that you find inside the Beltway, that we have a right and a responsibility to run the world. I don't like it at all, but most Americans do. It's in your interest to see that continue, because that way the Americans will feel compelled to keep forces in Europe and to treat you like little children who can't be trusted should the United States go away. And that way, the American pacifier will remain intact. And finally, you should hope that the American economy continues to flourish, so we have the wealth to generate the military forces that can stay here in Europe and act as a pacifier. All of this is a way of saying, in conclusion, that Europeans have a deep-seated interest for purposes of maintaining peace and keeping the transatlantic relationship that now exists alive and well. Thank you. I'll be glad to take questions from you.
Okay, so we'll move into just the Q&A part. So before we go to the audience, I'll just get the ball rolling with one question. So in this kind of the USA-China power struggle, Professor, how do you predict that playing out in the future? Who will win, and how do you predict that playing out, the USA-China kind of power struggle?
Well, the question is, given this competition between the United States and China, assuming that China continues to rise, how will it play itself out? I think that you can foresee two possible scenarios. One is, I think it is possible that China will become so big and so powerful that the United States will simply have to concede defeat and accept the fact that it has a peer competitor. The United States has never had a peer competitor. We contained and ultimately helped destroy Imperial Germany. We contained and ultimately helped destroy Nazi Germany. We contained and ultimately helped destroy Imperial Japan. And we contained and helped ultimately destroy the Soviet Union. You understand that we had 4 potential peer competitors in the 20th century. We helped destroy all 4 of them. I think one could argue that given the sheer size of China and the power projection problems that I alluded to in my talk, it may be the case that China just grows so powerful we can't prevent it from dominating Asia the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. I think that's the least likely of the 2 scenarios. I think the more likely scenario is that we will put together a balancing coalition and we will successfully contain China. I think you can already see the balancing coalition beginning to form in Asia. If you go home and you Google Japanese-Indian relations, think about this, Japanese-Indian relations. You all know your geography. India and Japan are physically separated from each other by great distances, right? But the Japanese and the Indians are becoming very friendly these days, mainly because both of them are interested in containing China. You can see the balancing coalition already beginning to form. It will involve South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, India, Japan, Russia, and the United States. And I think what will happen is that we will put together the balancing coalition, and much as we saw what happened in the Cold War, the balancing coalition here in Europe and the balancing coalition in Asia, China will be contained. I think that's the more likely scenario.
Okay, so I guess we'll open up to questions from the audience if there are any at this point.
Given that U.S. Military defense spending is probably the same as it's half of global defense spending, do you really see China being able to match that anytime soon? And do you think there's a possibility that China will be weakened because of its domestic problems, or if the economy slows down, will domestic problems arise?
Did everybody hear the question? I think, with regard to your first question, will China match American defense spending? He pointed out quite correctly that the United States spends as much money as almost all the other states in the world put together. It's amazing how much money we spend on defense. Are the Chinese likely to equal us anytime soon? I think the answer is no. I think it'll be another 10, 20 years, maybe even 30 years before China is spending the amount of money on defense that we now spend and has a military that is the equivalent of ours. It's very important to understand that China is today a paper tiger. China would be crazy to pick a fight with the United States today. The imbalance in military power is so great that they would be in really serious trouble if they were to pick a fight with us. If you were running Chinese foreign policy, if you were in Beijing, the smart thing to do now is just keep your mouth closed. Don't say anything provocative. If anything, what you want to do is talk in terms of peace, love, and dope. You want to take a page out of the American playbook. You know how all these American diplomats, people like Hillary Clinton, come over here and talk peace, love, and dope and make all Europeans feel good, right? That's what the Chinese want to do. You want to learn to engage in hypocrisy. Right? Hypocrisy is something that Anglo-Saxons, the British and the Americans are brilliant at this, right? Their ability to act ruthlessly. You Irish clearly understand this, right? How good the British were, and now the Americans at this, right? You know, talk one way but behave another way. This is what the Chinese want to do. They want to learn to talk peace, love, and dope, and not do anything provocative, and just continue to grow economically. Don't threaten your neighbors. Don't threaten the United States. Just continue to grow and turn into an economic Godzilla. Then you can translate that economic might into military might. You don't want to do that too soon. But they're a long way off from where they can do that. I think a couple decades away. And my argument is that when they do that, then they will be very powerful. What was your second question?
Domestic problems, so if the economy
domestic
slows down.
problems, yeah. This is a great question. Are there domestic problems in China that are likely to thwart economic growth? I've been to China a number of times, and I give this talk. It's the talk that I'm going to give this evening to the graduate students, master's degree students, on can China rise peacefully? And you've caught glimpses of it here. My answer is no. And it's quite striking to me how many smart Chinese say that the problem that I'm describing and the problem that we're talking about is never going to materialize because China is not going to continue to grow economically over the next 30 years the way it's grown over the past 30 years. And they talk about domestic political problems, what you're alluding to. Some people talk about the demographic problem. China is a rapidly aging population as well. It's because of the one-child policy. The average woman in any country has to have 2.1 babies to just maintain the existing population. If you have a one-child policy, right, that's less than half of what you need. Right? So the Chinese population is getting old. And as the Chinese like to say, the Japanese got rich before they got old. We're going to get old before we get rich, which means they're not going to have a welfare state in place that can take care of all those old people. And when you have an age pyramid that looks like this, you have very few people down below to take care of lots of people up top. What you want is an age pyramid like that, right? So people will tell you demographics are a huge problem. The lack of democracy, the fact that you have all sorts of legitimacy problems, growing out of the fact that you have this antiquated communist system. Just lots of possible things can go wrong. I don't know whether that's true or not. Who knows where it's all headed? My point to you is you want to hope that he's right and that they do have domestic problems that slow them down. because that's the best way to keep the Americans in Europe. But it may not happen, and there are a good number of Chinese who don't think it's going to happen. Sir?
And my question is not to do with the topic of the talk, but it is something we've dealt with before, the issue of the Israel Lobby. I was just, Norman Finkelstein spoke here there a few months ago about his new book, the coming end of the love affair with Israel. And I just wanted to get your opinion, like, do you think there's kind of being a bit of a change, not amongst like the political power structure, but amongst, we say, the public, you know, America does share kind of disproportionate relationship with Israel?
Yeah. I think that what has happened over the past, I would say, 25 years is that you've had a significant change in the United States in the discourse about Israel. And you've had a much more realistic assessment of Israel's history. And this includes contemporary history. When I was your age, I believe, and the vast majority of college students and well-educated people believed what I would call the Exodus myths. And by Exodus, I'm talking about Leon Uris's famous book, Exodus, which was written in the 1950s and described the founding of Israel in very idealistic terms. I think that the new historians in Israel have completely undermined the Exodus myths. And I think with the internet, it's hard even for Americans not to figure out what's happening in Israel today and to see that Israel is doing absolutely horrible things to the Palestinians, especially in the occupied territories. So that how most Americans, most educated Americans think about Israel, I think has changed in really significant ways since the 1950s, even the 1960s and 70s. And I think that with the passage of time, that awareness will become even more acute. What's not changed in the United States is policy. And policy has not changed in the United States in large part because the lobby is so powerful that no Congress person would dare challenge it. And even President Obama, who did pick a number of fights with Benjamin Netanyahu over the settlements, eventually backed off in every case, and now appears to be unwilling to challenge Netanyahu again. So American policy has not changed much at all. If anything, the United States is now more committed to defending Israel at every turn than it was in the past. But the discourse has changed, and this is what Norman Finkelstein is talking about. And Norman is talking about the fact that the American Jewish community is now well aware of what is going on. And his point is that this is only going to get worse with time. And I think that he's correct. If you look at Israel's body politic, it is becoming more and more conservative. And this is largely for demographic reasons, by the way. The ultra-Orthodox in Israel were very small in number when the state was founded in 1948, are growing by leaps and bounds, because your average ultra-Orthodox woman has 7.8 babies. And the ultra-Orthodox have clearly the most racist attitudes towards Palestinians. There was a recent piece in Haaretz that talked about a survey that showed this. And not far behind them are the Orthodox, who are also growing in numbers. So this is a country that's moving further and further to the right. And you'll see this reflected in the election in January. I think it's January 22nd. I'm sure that Netanyahu will get reelected. But if you look at the party list, it's much more right-wing than the previous party list from early 2009. So as Israel moves further and further to the right, and its policies towards the Palestinians become more draconian, it creates a situation inside the American Jewish community where liberal American Jews feel themselves alienated from Israel. Again, this is the Finkelstein point. And I think he's correct. And I think, as I started my comments, I think this is happening in the broader American society as well. And the question you have to ask yourself is, where does this all lead? Is it ever going to lead to a change in policy? That's the big question. In other words, as Israel becomes an apartheid state, and that's where it's headed, right? As it becomes an apartheid state, is it possible to sustain support for Israel in the United States and in Europe? Ehud Olmert, who was the former Israeli prime minister, said in November 2007, he said that if you do not have a two-state solution, Israel will turn into an apartheid state, and that will be the end of Israel. He said this when he was the prime minister. This is not Jimmy Carter speaking, this is not John Mearsheimer or Steve Walt speaking, not Norman Finkelstein. This is former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, when he was Prime Minister, saying that if you do not get a two-state solution, Israel will end up in a South Africa-like situation. That means it's an apartheid state. And he said that will be the end of Israel. That's what he said. Well, you're not going to get a two-state solution. I don't know how carefully you folks follow this, but the two-state solution is effectively dead because the Israelis continue to build settlements, right? And there's no place on the map where you can carve out a Palestinian state. You're going to end up with a greater Israel. Israel is going to control all the land of mandatory Palestine. It's going to control all the land from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. It already does. And I believe there are already more Palestinians than there are Israeli Jews inside Greater Israel. And there certainly will be in the future for demographic reasons. Right? So that's the apartheid state. And the question is, can Israel maintain itself as an apartheid state? Inside the United States, can it generate the necessary support? See, they're betting that the lobby is so powerful that it doesn't matter. That's the bet here. And what happens in Europe? And this is the policy question. So to sum it all up, discourse has changed. That's what Norman is saying, and he's correct. The discourse has changed. Right? The question is what happens with policy as the two-state solution disappears almost completely, and you move to a South Africa-like situation. Will Ehud Olmert be proved right or not? Yes?
About 20 years ago, but just before the Cold War ended, you wrote a German article in which you predicted that, like, if the Cold War ended and like the bipolar world order broke down, that would likely lead to like conflict in
Yes.
Northern Europe. Get the impression from your book there that the reason you think that didn't happen is because the American military stayed in Europe. So I guess the question then is, why do you think that the American military did stay in Europe after the Cold War ended and it was no longer going to bipolar situation?
Just to repeat the question, I wrote this piece, it's called Back to the Future in one place and Why We'll Soon Miss the Cold War in another place. And the argument was that with the Cold War ended, if the United States pulled out of Europe, and if the Soviets pulled out of Europe, you'd go back to the future. You'd have security competition with a serious possibility of war. And his question is, why did we stay in Europe? You know, it's funny. I wrote this piece. I wrote the original piece for a conference that former President Gerald Ford had with three of his buddies who ran Britain, France, and Germany when he was President of the United States. I got a call one day. It was in the fall of 1989. And it was from former President Ford. And I thought it was a crank phone call. Somebody was sort of calling me up. It was a joke, right? But it turned out that President Ford actually wanted to talk to me. And he said to me, when I got on the phone, he said, I had never met him before. He said, what's going on here is that I'm going to get together with 3 former European leaders, Helmut Schmidt of Germany, Francois Mitterrand of France, and James Callaghan of Britain. And the 4 of us are going to get together in a castle outside of London in February of 1990. And the agreement is that each one of us will bring 2 advisors. And the agreement is further that we'll bring 2 young advisors. I was actually young at the time. And he said, I would like you to be one of my 2 advisors. And he said, the deal is that you will write a paper for our meeting, right? So we'll have these 4 former heads of state, 8 advisors, because each has 2, and each of the 8 people will write a paper. So I said, fine. So the paper I wrote was the paper that he's alluding to, which was in the Atlantic Monthly and in International Security. And it was quite interesting because I was kind of treated like I was a skunk at the party, right? Everybody was celebrating the end of the Cold War and thought that the era of peace, love, and dope was here. And here comes John, who's back in the region, right? And kind of what they did with my paper at this meeting in the castle was they sort of locked it in the back closet and threw away the key. And we hardly talked about my paper at all. In fact, the other American who came, Jack Snyder, who teaches in Columbia, Jack kept saying, Jack is a peace, love, and doper. I love him dearly, but he is a peace, love, and doper. Jack kept saying at this conference, this meeting in the castle, he said, you know, John is raising some good points, and we really want to address the points he's raising. But we never did, because nobody wanted to talk about my paper. And afterwards, I figured that, you know, it really didn't register at all. It was just one of these interesting intellectual exercises that was kind of fruitless, because I figured most people thought I was kind of crazy. But I came to realize, it took me a while, because my learning curve is kind of like that. It took me a while to figure it out. But actually, I believe my argument resonated with everybody there, right? And I think that people understood that my argument was that if you took the Soviets out and you took the Americans out, you'd have trouble. And the key was not to take the Americans out. The Soviets were leaving. The key was to leave the Americans there and then move the Americans eastward. NATO expansion. Remember I talked about NATO expansion before. NATO expansion is designed to fill the vacuum that the Soviets left. And it's to get the American pacifier over as much of Europe as you can. Right? Remember I said to you, no European leader has ever asked the United States to leave. Take the American military and go home. Why is that? I believe, and this you have to take with some grains of salt because I have a self-serving interest in saying this, but I do believe that the main reason that nobody has asked us to leave is they know that there is a reasonable possibility that John is right. Otherwise, why would we leave all those people there? So I believe, this is a completely self-serving statement, that the reason we have stayed in Europe is because people listen to me. I'm being somewhat facetious.
I'm afraid, sorry, Professor, I'm afraid, unfortunately, that's all we have time for. But I'd like to thank Professor Mearsheimer for making a trip to Chicago here today and for your very compelling talk. I'm very immensely proud on behalf of the Phil to have Professor Mearsheimer as our latest honorary patronage on account of his contribution to international relations and political science as a whole. So I think we're also well scored Professor Mearsheimer back to council. We can have a party round of applause for